The last thing Michael said before he walked out of this house, the house I built with my own hands on a half-acre lot 43 years ago, was, "You built this house for yourself, not for us." He said it quietly, the way you say something you've been carrying for a long time and have finally decided to set down. Then he carried 4 boxes to a rented cargo van and drove east on Ridgewood Lane and was gone. That was 6 years ago. I did not call after him. I told myself I was the one who had been wronged, and that the first call was his to make. 6 years later, on a Tuesday morning, a text arrived from a number I didn't recognize. 5 words. "Dad, I need you." I read it once. I knew exactly who it was. I knew exactly what it cost him to send it, and I deleted it because I had spent 6 years building a room and calling it a fortress. And I was not yet ready to understand the difference. What Michael didn't know, and what I didn't know either, was that the door I thought I was closing was already the last one. The kettle kept boiling. I turned it off. That was the extent of my reaction. I turned off the kettle, poured the water over the coffee grounds, and stood at the counter while the kitchen filled with the smell of dark roast and the particular silence that comes at 6:40 in the morning in a house where only one person lives. The house is 4 bedrooms. I use 1. The other 3 have doors I don't open anymore. 6 years of silence has a texture. People who haven't lived it think silence is the absence of something. It isn't. It's a presence. It sits in chairs. It follows you down hallways. After the first year, I stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing a scar. It's still there. You just don't look directly at it. I had learned to move around it. I had learned to be efficient about it. Coffee at 6:40, the Denver Post on my tablet, though I rarely read past the headlines. A walk around the property before the heat came up. Work. Even in retirement, I still consulted twice a month for an engineering firm downtown. Structural reviews mostly, the kind of work that requires precision and rewards patience. I was good at both. The phone sat face down on the counter. I didn't turn it over. What I told myself in those first minutes was that the message hadn't surprised me, that I had known, somewhere in the back of the kind of mind that spent 30 years reading stress points in concrete and steel, that a message like that would come eventually, that I had been ready for it, that deleting it was the rational response, clean, final, no different from closing a file you've already reviewed and found unworkable. I told myself that. I picked up the coffee. It was too hot to drink, so I held it. The mug was one my wife had bought at a market in Taos in 1994, hand-thrown clay, slightly uneven on one side, a glaze the color of a Colorado sky in October. I have used it every morning for 11 years. Since she died, I held it and looked out of the window at the backyard, at the oak tree I planted the year Michael was born, which is now taller than the roof line. I thought I'd solved the problem. The oak tree was 28 years old. My son was 28 years old. I stood there long enough for the coffee to cool to the temperature where I could drink it, and then I drank it, and then I rinsed the mug and set it upside down on the drying rack, exactly where it always goes. The phone stayed face down on the counter. I left it there and went to get my jacket. I had a walk to take. The house I live in now is not the house I built. That is the simplest way I know to say it. 43 years ago, I poured the foundation myself on a half-acre lot on the eastern edge of what was then farmland and is now suburb. I was 29 years old, working for a civil engineering firm downtown, and I had enough saved for the land and the materials, but not enough for a contractor, so I did it the way my father had done things, slowly, on weekends, with borrowed equipment, and a neighbor named Carl who owed me a favor from a fence we'd put up the spring before. It took 14 months. My wife, Ellen, brought coffee out on Saturday mornings and sat on an overturned bucket and read while I worked. And that is the image I return to when I try to remember what it felt like to believe that what you were building would last. We raised 2 children in that house, Sarah first, then Michael, 4 years apart. The rooms filled up the way rooms do with noise and shoes left in hallways, and report cards on the refrigerator, and a dog we had for 9 years named Chester, who is buried under the oak tree in the backyard. The one I planted the spring Michael was born. The house was never quiet when they were young. I used to think the quiet would be a relief. Ellen died 11 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 4 months from diagnosis to the end. After the funeral, Sarah drove back to Portland, where she lives with her husband and her 2 boys. Michael stayed for a week, slept in his old room, helped me sort through his mother's clothes. We didn't talk much. We never had. Not the way Ellen and Michael talked those long conversations at the kitchen table that I'd walk past and not interrupt because I didn't know how to enter them. When Michael left that time, he hugged me at the door and said he'd call. He did, for a while. Then less. Then the Muthuan, 6 years ago. And then nothing at all. The house got quiet. I learned to work in it. I still get up at 5:30. Old habit from the job for 31 years. I was on site by 7, and the body doesn't forget. I make coffee in the same pot Ellen bought the year we renovated the kitchen. I drink it from the same mug I've used for 11 years, the one with the glaze the color of a Colorado October sky. I eat the same breakfast. I take the same walk down Ridgewood Lane, past the Henderson's place and the empty lot where the Garcias used to live. And I am back at the house by 7:15. I retired 4 years ago, and my days have a structure that would look, from the outside, like the life of a man who has made his peace. I have not made my peace, but I have made my routine, and for a long time I convinced myself those were the same thing. 6 years of silence from Michael is not the same as 6 years without Michael. That is the distinction I made very carefully and very privately, because I never told anyone what I was doing. I was watching, not constantly, not obsessively, or at least that is what I told myself. But I knew that he'd moved to Capitol Hill 3 years ago, into an apartment with a woman named Kara, who worked in graphic design. I knew he'd changed jobs twice. I knew he'd been passed over for a promotion at the startup, where he'd worked for the last 2 years. Because James, his friend from college, a man I'd met perhaps 4 times, posted something vague about it on Facebook, and Michael responded with a single emoji that I read for 20 minutes trying to determine its tone. I knew all of this the way you know things you have no right to know quietly, at a distance, without ever announcing yourself. I told myself I was watching because I was his father, and fathers don't stop. That is probably true, but there was something else in it too. Something I was less willing to name a need to confirm, every few months, that he was managing without me, that he had not needed me badly enough to call, that the silence was mutual and therefore fair. I'd been watching for 6 years, and he had never reached back, until Thursday. I had been expecting it, in some form. That sounds like arrogance, and maybe it is, but I had been an engineer for a long time. And one thing engineering teaches you is that systems under pressure eventually find their weak point and give. Michael was 28 years old, living in a city, working at a company that was based on what I could find not doing well. The economy does what it does. I had watched the indicators. I knew, in the way you know a load-bearing wall from a partition, that the call would come eventually. I was waiting for it the way you wait for a storm you've already tracked on radar, not surprised, just watching the front move in. When the text arrived Thursday morning, I read it once. I have already said that. What I have not said is how long I stood at the counter afterward, with the phone face up and the message sitting there in its gray bubble, before I made the decision. Dad, I need you. 5 words, no punctuation at the end. The kind of message a person sends when they've rewritten it 15 times and finally deleted all the other sentences and sent just the ones they couldn't argue themselves out of. I recognized the architecture of it. I had spent 30 years reading structural reports and knowing immediately which findings the engineer had buried in the qualifications and which ones he'd put in the summary because he had no choice. Michael had buried everything and sent only what he could not bury. I read it once, and I understood it completely, and that was exactly why I deleted it. I want to be clear about what I thought I was doing. I was not being cruel. I told myself I was being disciplined, that the message was a test of exactly the kind of weakness I had spent 6 years training myself against. If I answered, I would be answering from a place of sentiment, not judgment. I would be opening a door that had been closed for reasons that had not changed. The reasons were still there. The years were still there. You cannot delete 6 years of silence with 5 words, and I was not going to pretend otherwise. That is what I told myself. What I did not tell myself, and what I have since had a great deal of time to consider, is that I deleted the message before I could read it again, not after a long deliberation. Within 90 seconds of receiving it, I held the phone. I read the words, and then I pressed and held until the option appeared, and I deleted it. And I set the phone face down on the counter, and I went to get my jacket. I've been an engineer long enough to know what it means when you make a structural decision that fast. It doesn't mean you're certain. It means you're afraid that if you wait, you'll change your mind. The oak tree in the backyard was 28 years old. My son was 28 years old. I knew that when I planted that tree, I had believed I was building something that would outlast me, the way I believed it about the house, the way I believed it about the family I was raising inside it. The tree was still there. The house was still there. I put on my jacket and I went for my walk. The air was cold and smelled like wood smoke from somewhere down the block. I walked the full length of Ridgewood Lane without stopping, turned at the corner by the empty lot, and walked back. I did not look at my phone. By the time I returned, I had convinced myself, again, that I had done the reasonable thing. The coffee was cold. I poured it out and did not make more. The argument did not begin the way arguments usually do, with raised voices or a single wrong word. It began quietly, on a Sunday in October, 6 years ago, when Michael sat down at the kitchen table and told me he had accepted a job offer in Austin. He was 22 years old. He had graduated that May from Colorado State Civil Engineering, same field I'd spent 31 years in, which I had taken as a sign of something. He'd worn his cap and gown and shaken the dean's hand, and I had driven back from Fort Collins alone because he had gone out afterward with his friends. I told myself that was normal. I told myself a lot of things that year. He set the offer letter on the table between us. The company name was something I didn't recognize, a construction management firm, mid-size, based downtown Austin. The salary was printed at the top. It was not a bad salary for a 22-year-old with no field experience. I looked at the number, and then I looked at him. He said he thought I'd be proud. I told him I needed to think about it. He said there wasn't much to think about. He'd already accepted. He was telling me, not asking. I understood that. I set the letter back on the table face down, and I asked him when he planned to leave. 3 weeks, he said. I got up and poured myself a glass of water. I didn't drink. Outside the kitchen window, the oak tree I'd planted when Michael was 2 years old was losing its leaves. They came down one at a time in the still air. I stood at the window for a long time before I said anything else. What I said was, I built this house for this family. He said he knew that. I said, your mother's been gone 4 years. You're the only one left here. He said, Dad, I know, but I can't stay in Denver because you're lonely. That was the word he used. Lonely. I turned away from the window. He was sitting with his hands flat on the table, the way he used to sit when he was a boy, and he knew he was in trouble but had decided to hold his ground anyway. He had his mother's jaw. He had always had her jaw, that particular set to it when he'd made up his mind. I told him I wasn't asking him to stay because I was lonely. I told him I was asking him to stay because this was his home, because there was work here, because I could have brought him into the firm where I still consulted part-time, and he could have learned the business properly, instead of starting from nothing in a city where he knew no one. He said he didn't want to join the firm. I said, why not? He looked at the table. Then he said there was something else he needed to tell me. Her name was Elena. He had been seeing her for 14 months. She was 23, worked in marketing, lived in Austin. That was why Austin, not Chicago, not Seattle, not any of the other cities where a civil engineering job might make geographic sense. He had followed her. He had built his entire plan around a woman he had never brought to meet me, had never mentioned once in 14 months of Sunday phone calls and holiday dinners and the long silences that had been growing between us since his mother died. I asked him why he hadn't told me. He said he knew how I'd react. That landed differently than he intended it to. I heard it as an accusation. I heard it as him saying, I knew you would ruin it. I knew you would find something wrong. I knew you would make it about yourself. I told him I had never done anything to make him feel he couldn't bring a young woman home to meet his father. I told him I had worked for 31 years to give him a house where he could do exactly that. I told him that if he had kept this from me for 14 months, it was because he had already decided I didn't matter enough to include in his life. He said that wasn't it. I said, then what is it? He was quiet for a moment. He looked at me the way people look at something they've been trying to figure out for a long time and have finally, reluctantly, figured out. He said, you don't want me to have a life. Dad, you want me to have your life. I told him that was not true. He said, you've been deciding things for me since I was old enough to have opinions. What classes to take, what internships to apply for. You told me in my junior year that if I didn't go into civil engineering, you'd stop paying tuition. Do you remember that? I remembered it. I had said it. At the time, it had seemed reasonable I was paying. I had a right to some say in what I was paying for. That was how I had thought about it then. He said, you built this house and you raised me in it, and I'm grateful for that. I am. But you talk about it like I owe you something I can never finish paying. Like I'm supposed to spend the rest of my life inside these walls because you built them. And I can't do that, Dad. I'm 22 years old, and I can't do that. The room was very quiet. The furnace clicked on. Outside, another leaf came down from the oak. I said, if you leave like this, you're no longer my son. I meant it as a line. I meant it the way you mean things when you are frightened and trying to sound certain as a door you can close to keep something out. He looked at me for a long time after I said it, long enough that I thought he might argue, might push back, might give me something to push against. He didn't. He nodded once, slowly, the way you nod when someone has finally told you something you already knew. Then he stood up, pushed his chair back carefully so it didn't scrape the floor, and walked down the hallway to his room. I heard him in there for the rest of the afternoon. Drawers opening and closing. The sound of boxes. I sat at the kitchen table until the light changed and the room went gray. And I did not get up. I did not go down the hall. I did not knock on the door. He left the following Saturday. I know, because I watched from the window of my study on the second floor, the window that faces the driveway. He carried 4 boxes and 2 duffel bags to a rented cargo van. A friend helped him. I didn't recognize the friend. They made 3 trips each. Michael looked up at the house once, at the second floor, and I stepped back from the window. I don't know if he saw me. I told myself he hadn't. He did not knock on the door before he left. I had not expected him to. The van backed out of the driveway and turned east on Ridgewood Lane and was gone. In the weeks after, I told myself he would call. I told myself he needed time to settle, to realize that Austin wasn't what he'd imagined, that the job would be harder than he'd expected, that Elena would turn out to be a poor decision. I told myself these things with the same patience I had applied to construction timelines, certain that the foundation would hold, certain that the structure would eventually conform to the blueprint. I had always been good at waiting. He did not call. I told myself, then, that he owed me the first call, that I had said what I'd said out of pain, and he knew that. And if he had any understanding of what I'd given him over 22 years, he would make the first move. That was what I told myself. I told myself he needed to learn that actions had consequences, that I was not going to chase a grown man who had walked out of his own father's house without a word. 3 months after he left, my phone rang at 9 in the evening. I looked at the screen. It was Michael. I let it ring 4 times. Then I set the phone face down on the desk and waited until it stopped. He tried twice more over the following 2 years. Once on a Thursday evening in March, I remember because I was in the middle of reviewing a set of drainage plans for a consulting project, and I saw his name on the screen, and I set the phone aside and went back to the plans. Once more on a Sunday in November, which would have been close to Thanksgiving. I did not answer that one either. I never called back. I told myself, each time, that the call was not an apology, that if he had wanted to reconcile, he would have said so in a voicemail. He left no voicemails. I took that as confirmation that he wasn't ready to acknowledge what he'd done the way he'd left, the things he'd said, the 14 months of silence about Elena, the accusation that I had wanted to own his life. I took the absence of voicemails as evidence that I was right to wait. What I did not tell myself in those years was the other thing, the thing that sat in the back of the study like a piece of equipment I had stopped maintaining and was no longer sure still worked. I did not tell myself that I had said the words first, that I had drawn the line, that when he nodded and went to his room to pack, he had been taking me at my word, and everything that followed, every unanswered call, every year of silence, every Sunday that passed without his voice in this house had started with me, in that kitchen, with the furnace clicking on and the oak losing its leaves outside. I did not let myself think that. I was very disciplined about not letting myself think that. 6 years is a long time to be disciplined about a single thing, long enough that the discipline starts to feel like the truth, long enough that you stop distinguishing between what you decided and what simply happened. I was 62 years old, and I lived alone in a house I had built with my own specifications, and I'd convinced myself, thoroughly and without obvious effort, that the silence was his fault, and the waiting was his responsibility, and the first call, whenever it finally came, would be the beginning of his apology. I never reached out, not once in 6 years. I told myself that was strength. I had been telling myself that for long enough that I had stopped examining whether it was true. I set the phone face down on the kitchen counter and picked up the wrench. The faucet in the downstairs bathroom had been dripping for 11 days. I had counted the drips the first night irregular, maybe one every 4 seconds, sometimes 2 in quick succession, and I had told myself I would fix it on Saturday, and then Saturday became the following Tuesday, and the following Tuesday became 11 days of a sound I could hear from the hallway if the house was quiet enough. The house was almost always quiet enough. I had a list of small repairs that I worked through on a rotating basis, not because the house needed constant attention, but because the work gave the hours a shape. Replace the weather stripping on the garage door, recaulk the window above the kitchen sink, sand and restain the third porch step, which had begun to show the grain in a way that bothered me every time I walked out to get the mail. I got the faucet open in about 4 minutes. The washer was worn through at the edge, a clean failure, the kind that announces itself plainly if you know what to look for. I had the replacement in the small plastic organizer I kept on the third shelf of the garage, labeled in my own handwriting, faucet washers, assorted. I had organized that shelf the winter after Ellen died, when I needed something to do with my hands at 10 o'clock at night. That was 7 years ago. The label was still legible. I was fitting the new washer into place when the phone rang. I didn't move immediately. I let it ring twice, the way I always did, because I had learned over the years that the first ring was often the moment before I decided whether I wanted to answer at all. The second ring confirmed that someone was still there. I dried my hands on the dish towel I'd hung over the cabinet door and looked at the screen. Sarah. My daughter was 41 years old and lived in Fort Collins, 45 minutes north. She called on Sunday evenings, usually around 7, and occasionally on holidays. It was a Thursday afternoon. I answered. Dad. Her voice had a particular quality, not urgent, but compressed, the way a voice sounds when someone has decided exactly what they are going to say before they dial. Did Michael reach out to you? I stood in the bathroom doorway. The faucet was still open on the counter, the old washer sitting in a small curl beside it. I said nothing for a moment. Dad, I heard you, I said. Did he reach out to you? The phone had been face down on the kitchen counter for 3 hours. I had not looked at it again. I had fixed the garage weather stripping and eaten a sandwich and begun on the faucet, and I had not looked at it once because there was nothing to look at. I had made sure of that. I didn't get any message, I said. The silence on her end lasted exactly long enough to tell me she didn't believe it. Michael texted you 3 hours ago, she said. He said he needed you. He told me he sent it. He showed James the screen before he hit send. Her voice was still controlled, but there was something underneath it that I recognized the specific restraint of someone who has decided not to raise their voice because raising their voice would give me something to respond to. Sarah had learned that from watching me. "What did you do, Dad?" I looked at the old washer on the counter. The rubber had compressed unevenly, more on one side than the other, which meant the seal had been failing gradually for months before it gave out entirely. That was how most failures worked, not a sudden break, a slow compression until the thing no longer held. "If Michael really needed me," I said, "he wouldn't have left in the first place." I said it the way I had said similar things before, evenly, as a statement of fact rather than an argument. It was a position I had held for 6 years, and I knew the architecture of it well enough to present it without obvious effort. Michael had left. Michael had cut contact. Michael had made a choice, and that choice had consequences. And one of those consequences was that he did not get to decide, 6 years later, that the lines of communication were opened simply because he needed something. That was a coherent position. I had built it carefully. "He's in the hospital, Dad." She said it quietly. Not for effect, I know the difference. She said it the way you say something when you have been carrying it for several hours and you are finally setting it down in front of someone else. Then she hung up. I stood in the bathroom doorway for a moment. The house was very quiet. The faucet was off. I had replaced the washer before the call, and there was no dripping sound. And the absence of it was more noticeable than the dripping had been. I did not stand there long. I put the tools back in the garage in their correct places. I washed my hands at the newly silent faucet. Then I picked up the phone, not to call Sarah back, not to wait for more information, not to deliberate, and I looked up the number for Denver Health on Bannock Street, the number I had driven past 100 times without needing. I found it on the second search. I dialed. The operator transferred me to the emergency department. A nurse put me on hold. I counted the refrigerator hum while I waited a low, even frequency I had noticed years ago and never fixed because it was consistent, and consistency is easier to live with than silence. Dr. Patricia Chen picked up. She introduced herself as Michael's attending physician and asked if I was Robert Calloway. I said I was. She told me about the collision on I-25 northbound, the fractured ribs, the lacerated forearm, the concussion they were monitoring. She delivered it in the measured cadence of someone who has said similar things many times. I asked if he was okay. She said he was stable. Then she said, "He's been asking for you." I did not respond immediately. "I'll come in," I said. She said she would be at the nursing station on the 3rd floor. I hung up before Sarah called back. I was already reaching for my jacket. I had been hearing that sound for 11 days, and now it was gone, and the quiet it left behind had a different texture than the quiet I was used to. Hospital was not a specific word. It covered a range of things, most of them ordinary. People went to hospitals for broken bones, for infections, for the kind of exhaustion that needed monitoring. Michael was 28 years old and in reasonable health, as far as I knew, which was not very far, which was a fact I had arranged and then stopped examining. A hospital admission at 28 was not, in itself, a catastrophe. I picked up the old washer from the counter and dropped it into the small trash bin under the sink. I put the tools back in the garage in their correct places. I washed my hands at the newly silent faucet and dried them on the same dish towel and hung it back over the cabinet door. The phone was still on the kitchen counter, face down. I turned it over. The screen was dark. I pressed the button on the side and looked at it. No new messages. No missed calls except Sarah's, which was already logged. The conversation thread with Michael's number showed nothing. I had made certain of that 3 hours ago, and it still showed nothing, which was exactly what I had intended. I set the phone face down again. Sarah knew about the message. That was a complication, but a manageable one. She knew Michael had sent it. She did not know what it said. Not precisely she knew he had said he needed me, which was vague enough that it gave me room to work with. James had seen the screen before Michael hit send, which was a larger complication, but James was Michael's friend, not mine. And what James had seen and what James could prove were different things entirely. I had been an engineer for 31 years. I understood the difference between a load-bearing element and a decorative one. Sarah's call was weight-bearing. She would not let this go. But I had managed weight-bearing conversations with Sarah before. I knew how they moved and where they stalled and what I could say that would end them without resolution. Hospital was still not a specific word. I went to the garage and looked at the third porch step, which still needed sanding. I ran my thumb along the grain where the finish had worn through. The wood underneath was sound. The damage was only surface. That happened sometimes. The structure held even when the surface gave way. I went back inside and started the kettle for tea. The hospital number was not in my contacts. I had to look it up. Denver Health, the main campus on Bannock Street, the number I had driven past 100 times in 30 years without ever needing to dial it. I found it on the second search. The kettle had not yet boiled. I turned off the burner and called. The operator transferred me to the emergency department. A nurse put me on hold for 2 minutes and 40 seconds. I counted the refrigerator hum while I waited, a low, even frequency I had noticed years ago and never fixed, because it was consistent, and consistency is easier to live with than silence. Dr. Patricia Chen picked up. She introduced herself as Michael's attending physician and asked if I was Robert Calloway. I said I was. She said Michael had been brought in 6 hours ago following a motor vehicle collision on I-25 northbound. She said he had been conscious at the scene and had remained stable through admission and imaging. She said there were 2 fractured ribs, a lacerated forearm requiring sutures, and a moderate concussion they were monitoring. She delivered all of this in the measured cadence of someone who had said similar things many times and had learned that the facts were kinder than the pause before them. I asked if he was okay. She said he was stable. Then she said, "He's been asking for you." I did not respond immediately. The refrigerator hum continued. I was aware of the kettle on the burner, unlit now, and the specific quality of the kitchen light at that hour, flat and even, the kind that showed everything without flattering anything. "I'll come in," I said. She said she would be at the nursing station on the 3rd floor. The drive from the house to Denver Health is 22 minutes without traffic. I know this because I drove it once when Eleanor had her appendix out in 2009, and I drove it again when my own father was transferred there in 2014, and both times I had noted the route and the time the way I noted most things, not sentimentally, but because information is more useful than feeling when you need it. It was 22 minutes. I drove it in 22 minutes. On Hampton Avenue, I thought Michael should have called instead of texting. A phone call creates an obligation that a text message does not. A text message sits in a queue. It can be misread, delayed, lost in a notification stack. I had not seen the text immediately. Anyone could understand that. Anyone reasonable would understand that. On Broadway, I thought I did not recognize the number. That was the truth. I had deleted Michael's contact 6 years ago, a practical decision, not a punitive one. You cannot be expected to recognize a number you have no record of. I had read the message and not responded because I needed time to consider my response. That was not negligence. That was deliberation. On Bannock, I thought one text message is not a crisis. A crisis has a shape. It announces itself differently. If Michael had needed me urgently, he would have called. He would have called more than once. He would have had someone else call. One text message from an unknown number at 9 in the evening was not, by any reasonable interpretation, an emergency. I parked in the visitor structure on the east side. I sat in the car for a moment with the engine off. The structure smelled like exhaust and concrete, the same smell as every parking garage I had ever been in, which was a comfort of a kind, because it was not personal. Dr. Patricia Chen was waiting at the nursing station on the 3rd floor, as she had said she would be. She was younger than her voice, early 40s. I estimated, with the particular stillness of someone who had learned not to show what she was calculating. She shook my hand and thanked me for coming. Then she asked, "Why didn't you answer when Michael called?" I said my phone had been on silent. She looked at me for a moment. Not long, 3, perhaps 4 seconds. The kind of look that does not require duration to communicate its content. She did not say anything further on the subject. She said she would take me to Michael's room and explain the discharge timeline and she turned and walked ahead of me down the corridor. The room was at the end of the hall. She pushed the door open and stood aside. Michael was in the bed nearest the window. The blinds were partially open, and the light from the parking structure fell across the lower half of the bed in pale strips. His left forearm was bandaged from wrist to elbow. There was bruising along his jaw and collarbone, the particular coloration of an impact injury, deep purple at the center shading to yellow at the edges. His eyes were closed. A monitor beside the bed tracked his pulse in a slow, steady line. He did not look like a man of 28. He looked younger than that, the way people sometimes look when they are asleep and not performing anything for anyone. I stood at the foot of the bed. I did not move toward him. I did not speak. "Doctor," Chen remained in the doorway. I was aware of her presence the way you are aware of a structural element. You did not design something load-bearing that belongs to someone else's plan. Michael's chest rose and fell. The monitor continued its line. I had nothing to say that would have been true and also useful, so I said nothing. I stood at the foot of the bed and looked at my son, and the silence in that room was not the silence I had chosen for 6 years. It was a different kind, the kind that fills a space after something has already been lost and simply has not been named yet. The chair beside Michael's bed was a standard hospital chair, molded plastic, the color of old bone. I pulled it close enough that I could see the rise and fall of his chest without having to look at the monitor. Then I sat down. It was past 11 at night. The nurses changed shift at midnight. I know this because I watched the clock on the wall across from me, the way I used to watch the clock in my office when a project was behind schedule and I had run out of things I could still fix. Michael's hands were resting on top of the blanket. His left hand had an IV line taped to the back of it. He had his mother's hands the same shape of knuckle, the same way the fingers lay slightly curved, even at rest. I noticed this and then looked away. I thought about the message, not the phone, not the act of deleting it, the words themselves. "Dad, I need you." 4 words. I had read them once and then I had pressed delete. And I had told myself that the act of reading was not the same as receiving, that I had made no agreement by seeing them, that they were his words, not my obligation. Sitting in that chair, at that hour, I understood that I had been wrong about the nature of what he had sent me. I had read it as a demand. It was not a demand. It was the kind of message a person sends when they have already run out of every other option, when the pride that kept them away for 6 years has finally cost them more than they can pay, and they are asking, not for rescue, but for a door to be left open. He had not asked me to fix anything. He had asked me to be there. Those are not the same thing, and I had treated them as if they were. Sarah arrived at 7:15 the following morning. She came through the door with 2 coffees she didn't offer to share, set them both on the windowsill, and looked at me the way a person looks at a wall they are deciding whether or not to put their fist through. She said, "Michael called you because he was scared. He was scared before the accident. He wanted to come home." I said, "What was he scared of?" She said, "He lost his job. His girlfriend left him. He had nowhere to go. He wanted to come home to you." She said it without raising her voice. That was worse than if she had raised it. "This wasn't the first time he tried. You know that." I did know that. I had known it the first time, and the second, and I had made the same calculation each time that silence was a position, that not responding was a kind of answer, that I was protecting something by holding the line. I had believed that long enough that it had started to feel like principle rather than fear. Sarah picked up one of the coffees and looked at her brother. "He told James he'd tried 3 times, she said. "He said he kept hoping you'd just pick up." I looked at Michael's hands on the blanket, the IV line, the shape of his knuckles. I had not lost my son 6 years ago, when he walked out of my house and stopped returning my calls. I had lost him the morning I read 4 words on a screen and decided that pressing delete was the same thing as not having seen them. The house in Littleton was still standing. The files in my office were still organized. Everything I had built to demonstrate that I was a man of order and consequence was still exactly where I had placed it. None of it was what he had needed. None of it was what I had actually been protecting. I did not say any of this to Sarah. She would not have found it sufficient, and she would have been right. I sat in the chair. Michael's chest rose and fell. Outside the window, Denver was beginning its morning, indifferent and on schedule, the way cities always are. The nurse's name was Angela. She had been on Michael's floor for the full 24 hours since he'd been admitted, and when she came in to check his vitals at 7 in the morning, she spoke to him the way people speak to someone they've been quietly worried about, not clinically, but carefully. I was still in the chair by the window. I had not slept. Angela took Michael's blood pressure, made a note on her tablet, and then, without looking up, she asked him, "Did your dad come?" Michael's eyes moved to me. I watched him decide how to answer. There was a pause that lasted perhaps 3 seconds, which is a long time when you are the subject of it. "Yes," he said, but he didn't say anything. He just sat there. Angela looked up then. Not at Michael, at me. It was a brief look, professional and without warmth, the kind of look that takes a measurement and records it. She made another note on her tablet. I did not ask what she wrote. I already understood that whatever it was, it would follow Michael's chart, and through his chart, it would follow me. She left the room without speaking to me directly. I watched the door close behind her and thought about what it means when someone writes something down about you without telling you what it is. Sarah arrived at 8:15. She had brought coffee, 2 cups, one for herself and one for Michael. Nothing for me. She set them on the tray table, kissed Michael on the forehead, and sat in the second chair without acknowledging that I was in the room. Michael watched both of us with the careful attention of someone who has been in this position before, positioned between two people who are not speaking to each other, trying to determine which direction the damage will come from. At 9 o'clock, Dr. Patricia Chen appeared in the doorway and asked if I would join her in the consultation room down the hall. I had seen Dr. Chen briefly the previous evening when she had explained Michael's condition to Sarah and me together, the exhaustion, the dehydration, the collapse that the intake report called a stress-related episode in the careful language that hospitals use when they mean something more than the words say. She was a compact woman in her mid-40s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the specific manner of someone who has delivered difficult information so many times that she no longer softens it unnecessarily. The consultation room was small. There was a table, 4 chairs, a window that faced the parking structure. She closed the door. She said, "Michael told me that he texted you before the accident. He said he needed help." She paused. "What did you do with that message?" I said I didn't see it. She looked at me for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "That's not what Sarah told me. She said you got the message and deleted it." The room was quiet enough that I could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. I had counted the acoustic tiles above the table. There were 16. I had been counting things for 36 hours as a way of keeping my hands still. I said, "That's family business." "Doctor," Chen set her pen down on the table. She did it slowly, the way you set something down when you want the gesture to be understood as deliberate. She said, "No, it's not. Your son is my patient. He came into this hospital because he had been under severe psychological stress for an extended period, and the record indicates that reaching out to you was one of the last things he attempted before he collapsed. He asked for help, and according to what Sarah told me, and what I have now documented in his file, you received that message and deleted it." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "That is abandonment. I want you to understand that I'm using that word with precision, not as an accusation. I'm using it because it describes what happened." I did not answer. I had spent 6 years using silence as a form of authority, as proof that I was the one who decided when a conversation was over. Sitting across from Dr. Patricia Chen in a room that smelled like recycled air and institutional carpet, I understood for the first time that silence is only a weapon when the other person is uncertain. She was not uncertain about anything. She said, "He's been asking for you, not because he wants an apology. He's not there yet. He's asking because you're his father, and that doesn't stop mattering even when it should." She picked up her pen again. I'm going to ask you to think carefully about what you do next, because what you do in the next few days will determine whether your son ever asks for you again." She stood, opened the door, and left me in the room with the 16 tiles and the view of the parking structure. I sat there for 4 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the wall. When I came back out into the hallway, I understood immediately that something had changed in the configuration of the floor. The nurse at the station, not Angela, a younger man whose badge said Derek, looked up when I passed and then looked away with a speed that was itself a form of information. 2 other staff members near the medication cart stopped their conversation as I walked by. They did not resume it until I had passed. Sarah had told Dr. Chen. Dr. Chen had documented it. The documentation existed in a system that Angela had already accessed once that morning. In a hospital, information moves the way water moves, not dramatically, not all at once, but thoroughly, finding every available channel until there is nowhere it has not reached. I went back to Michael's room. Sarah was reading something on her phone. Michael was looking at the ceiling. Neither of them spoke when I entered. I sat in my chair by the window. At 11:30, the door opened and James walked in. I knew who he was before he introduced himself. Michael had mentioned him in the years before the silence, his college roommate, the one who had started the software company with him, the one Michael had described as the person who understood him best. James was tall, maybe 30, with the particular tiredness of someone who had driven a long distance without sleeping. He had a bag over one shoulder. He went directly to Michael's bed, gripped his hand for a moment, and said something quiet that I did not hear. Then he turned around. He looked at me the way people look at something they have already decided about, not with anger. Exactly, anger would have been easier. With a kind of settled disappointment, the kind that does not require explanation because the explanation has already been given by someone else. He said, "Michael told me about the text. He said he was terrified." He paused. "And you deleted it." He did not wait for me to respond. He turned back to Michael, said something else I could not hear, set the bag on the chair beside the bed, and then walked out of the room. He did not look at me again. There is a particular quality to being seen by someone who has already made up their mind about you. It is different from being judged by someone who is still deciding. James had driven however many hours he had driven because Michael had called him, not me. James and he had come. He had stood in that room for less than 3 minutes and said 9 words to me, and then left. 9 words, and every one of them placed exactly where it would do the most damage. Not because he was trying to damage me, but because they were simply true. I had spent 6 years believing that the people who mattered would eventually understand my position, that the silence would be interpreted as principle rather than punishment, that when Michael was ready, when he had grown enough, failed enough, learned enough, he would return and the terms would be mine. What I had not calculated was James. What I had not calculated was Angela writing something on a tablet at 7 in the morning. What I had not calculated was Dr. Chen using the word abandonment with the precision of someone who has a specific meaning in mind and is not interested in negotiation. I stood and walked out of Michael's room and down the hallway to the elevator bank. I pressed the button for the lobby. I stood in the elevator with 2 other people, a woman in scrubs carrying a paper cup, an older man with a visitor badge, and none of us spoke. When the doors opened, I walked to a bench near the entrance and sat down. The lobby of a hospital at midday has a specific texture. People arrive with fear and leave with information, and the space holds both at the same time, which gives it a weight that ordinary public spaces don't have. I sat on that bench and watched people come through the automatic doors, and I thought about a morning 6 years ago when a 22-year-old had stood in my kitchen and told me that he needed me to co-sign a loan, that he had a plan, that he believed in it, and I had told him no, not because I lacked the means, but because I had decided that the lesson of self-sufficiency was more valuable than the thing he was asking for. He had left that afternoon. He had not called again for 6 years. I had told myself, in the years between, that I had been right, that the lesson had been necessary, that a man who could not stand on his own was not a man I had raised him to be. I had organized this narrative carefully and returned to it regularly, the way you return to a document you have saved in a reliable location, knowing it will be there when you need it. The text message had arrived at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning. 4 words. I had read them once. I had pressed delete. I had put the phone face down on the drafting table in my office and gone back to the elevation drawings I had been reviewing. And I had told myself, I remember this clearly. I remember the exact quality of the light coming through the office window, that he would find another way. What I had not considered was that he might not. What I had not considered was Angela and her tablet and the note she had made at 7 in the morning when she asked a patient whether his father had come. And the patient had said yes, but he didn't say anything. He just sat there. What I had not considered was that those words, written in a hospital record, constituted a form of evidence that no amount of pressing delete would reach. I went back upstairs at 2 o'clock. Michael was asleep. Sarah was still in the chair beside his bed. She looked at me when I came in, and I saw in her face something I had not seen there before, not anger, which I had been prepared for, but pity, which I had not been prepared for at all, and which was considerably worse. She said, quietly, so as not to wake Michael, "You should go home, Dad." I said, "I want to stay." She said, "I know you do." She looked at her brother, then back at me. But what you want stopped being the thing that matters. I did not argue. I picked up my jacket from the back of the chair by the window. I looked at Michael for a moment, his face in sleep, the particular quality of his stillness, the way he had always slept with one hand slightly open, a thing I had not thought about in 6 years and now could not stop seeing. Then I walked out. The hallway was the same hallway it had been all day. Derek at the nurse's station did not look up. The 2 staff members near the medication cart were different people now, the shift having changed, but the effect was identical, a brief attention and then a looking away that communicated everything. I pressed the elevator button. I rode down to the lobby. I walked through the automatic doors into the Denver afternoon, which was cold and bright and entirely indifferent to what had just happened on the 4th floor. Michael was discharged 6 days later. I know because Sarah called me not to tell me when to come, but to tell me that he was leaving and that he would be staying with her. She said it plainly, without cruelty, the way you deliver a fact that has already been decided by the people it concerns. I said, "Can I see him?" She said, "When he's ready, and not without me there." There was a pause. I said, "All right." She said, "Dad." Another pause. "You deleted his message. You need to understand what that means to him." I said, "I understand." She said, "No." Her voice was not unkind. That was the part that stayed with me afterward, the part I turned over in the days that followed, the way you turn over a stone to see what is underneath it. Her voice was not unkind. "You understand that you did it. You don't understand yet what it cost. That's going to take a while." She hung up. I set the phone down on the drafting table in my office, in the same place I had set it 6 years ago, after a conversation with a 22-year-old who had needed something from me and not received it, and 6 days ago, after I had read 4 words on a screen and pressed delete, and I sat in my chair and looked at the elevation drawings still spread across the table, the clean, precise lines of structures designed to bear weight, and I did not pick up a pencil. Outside, the Littleton afternoon was doing what afternoons in Littleton do, going about its business. The mountains visible and indifferent, the neighborhood quiet, everything in its place. Everything I had built to demonstrate that I was a man of order and consequence. Michael went to live with Sarah. I did not go to the house. I waited, the way I had always waited, for the terms to become mine again. But the phone did not ring with his number. The days passed, and the drawings stayed on the table, and the house stayed large and quiet around me, and I understood, sitting in that stillness, that this silence was different from every silence I had chosen before it. This one was not mine. I drove to the hardware store on Bowles Avenue 2 days after the hospital. I needed weather stripping for the back door. It had been letting cold air in since October, and I had been meaning to fix it. I bought the weather stripping and a new set of drill bits and a tube of exterior caulk. The man at the register, a young man named Kyle who had worked there since before I stopped counting the years, asked how my project was going. I told him it was a maintenance job. He said those were the most satisfying kind. I paid and drove home and put the weather stripping in the garage next to the other things I had bought and not yet used. That was 2 weeks after the hospital. I did not fix the back door. The phone calls started on a Thursday morning. 5 calls over 11 days, Michael's number appearing on the screen each time, the way it had not appeared for 6 years, and now appearing and going unanswered in the opposite direction. I let it ring, not because I was punishing him. I told myself it was because I needed to find the right words first. I had been an engineer for 31 years. I understood that structural failures have causes, that causes can be identified, that identified causes can be addressed. I needed to identify the cause before I spoke. I needed to know what I was going to say. The 5th call went to voicemail. I did not leave one. I sent an email on a Saturday evening. I wrote 3 drafts. The first draft was 4 paragraphs. The second was 1 paragraph. The third was 2 sentences. I know I was wrong. I would like to talk when you're ready. I sent the 3rd draft and then sat at the kitchen table and watched the clock on the microwave. The email was not answered that night. It was not answered the following week. I checked the sent folder twice to confirm it had gone through. It had. I sent a text message 10 days after the email. I wrote, "Michael, I'm here if you want to talk." I read it twice before I sent it. Then I sent it. It showed delivered. It did not show read. I understood. Looking at that word, delivered, what it meant to be on the other side of a message that someone had chosen not to open. I drove to Sarah's house on a Wednesday afternoon in November. She lives in a neighborhood in Englewood, a cream-colored house on a corner lot with a Japanese maple in the front yard that had gone red and then bare by the time I arrived. I parked at the curb. I sat in the car for 4 minutes. Then I walked to the front door and knocked. Sarah opened it. She was wearing a gray sweater and she had her hair back. And she looked at me the way she has looked at me since she was 17 years old, with a clarity that I have never known how to answer. She did not open the screen door. I said, "Is Michael here?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Can I come in?" She said, "No." I stood there. The maple tree behind me had lost everything by then bare branches. Nothing left to give. I said, "I just want to say something to him. One thing." Sarah looked at me for a moment, not with anger that would have been easier. She looked at me the way you look at something that has already happened, that is already finished, that you are simply confirming the shape of. She said, "You had your chance. Dad, you deleted it." I did not answer. She was right, and I had no argument. And I had known since the hospital that I had no argument. And standing on that porch in November, I felt the full weight of that knowledge the way you feel a structural load, not all at once, but as a sustained pressure distributed across everything you are. She said, "I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm telling you what he told me to say." She paused. "He said if you came, to tell you he hopes you're okay, and to tell you he's okay, and that he needs more time." I said, "How much time?" She said she didn't know. I drove home on University Boulevard, and then on Hampton, and then on the streets I have driven for 34 years, and I did not count anything. I did not count traffic lights or turns or the number of houses I passed. I drove the way a man drives when he is not going somewhere so much as returning to the only place left. The kitchen was the same. The table was the same. The microwave clock read 4:47 and then 4:48, and I sat down in the chair I always sit in, the one that faces the window, that faces the backyard, and I looked at the yard. I had built the fence in that yard in 1994. I had poured the concrete footings myself, mixed by hand, because I wanted to know it would hold. 30 years later, it was still holding. I picked up my phone. I went to the deleted messages folder. On my phone, a habit from the years when I worked on government contracts and had to maintain documentation, the deleted messages stay in a recovery folder for 30 days before they're gone permanently. I had deleted Michael's message 19 days ago. It was still there. Dad, I need you. 4 words, sent at 11:23 in the morning on a Tuesday. I had read it once, standing in this kitchen, at this table, and I had felt the pull of it. I had felt it the way you feel a load-bearing wall when you press your hand against it, something essential behind the surface, and I had deleted it anyway, because I had decided, in the 6 years since Michael left, that I would not be moved, that I would not be the one who reached first, that the terms of reconciliation would be mine or they would be nothing. I had been wrong about what the terms were. I had been wrong about what I was protecting. I did not delete the message again. I moved it back to my inbox and I left it there, at the top of the thread, the only message in a 6-year thread, and I put the phone face down on the table, and I looked at the backyard and the fence I had built and the mountains that were visible above the roofline, the way they are always visible, indifferent and permanent, and there regardless of what happens in the houses below them. I had spent 6 years teaching myself that silence was a form of control. I had built an entire architecture of it, the unreturned calls, the unmailed letters I had written and kept in the desk drawer, the deliberate absence from events I could have attended. I had told myself that this was dignity, that I was not chasing, that I was holding a position. What I had actually been doing was building a room and locking myself inside it and calling the room a fortress. The weather stripping was still in the garage. The back door was still letting in cold air. I had been meaning to fix it since October, and it was now November, and I had not fixed it because fixing it would have taken 40 minutes, and I had 40 minutes every day, and I had spent those 40 minutes sitting in rooms thinking about what I was owed instead of doing the small, concrete, fixable things in front of me. I went to the garage and got the weather stripping and fixed the back door. It took 38 minutes. When I pressed the door shut afterward, the cold air was gone. The seal held. It was the most useful thing I had done in 2 months. The year moved the way years move when you are 62 and living alone in a house built for more people than are in it. I drove to work on the 2 consulting contracts I still maintained. I had dinner twice with a man named Gerald Marsh, who had been my project manager on the Thornton Bridge job in 2008 and who had retired to Lakewood and called occasionally to eat bad Mexican food and argue about construction tolerances. Gerald did not ask about Michael. I had told him, briefly, in October, what had happened. He had listened and said, "You going to fix it?" I had said I was trying. He had said, "Try faster." That was the end of that conversation. What Gerald did not tell me that night, what he told me 3 weeks later, over the phone, in the particular tone of a man who has been sitting on information and has finally decided you need it, was that Michael had called him in October, not to talk about me directly, to ask, through Gerald, whether I was all right, whether I was eating, whether the consulting work was keeping me busy. Gerald had answered carefully, the way a man answers when he understands he is being used as a bridge by 2 people who are too proud to build one themselves. He said Michael had listened without saying much, and then thanked him, and hung up. Gerald told me this, and then said, "He's still watching. Robert, same as you." I did not say anything for a moment. Then I said, "You should have told me sooner." Gerald said, "You weren't ready sooner." I did not argue with that, because he was right. I did not try faster. I tried at the pace I was capable of, which was slow, because the thing I was trying to fix was not a door or a fence or a bridge. It was something I had broken across 6 years of careful, deliberate choices, and it did not respond to the tools I knew how to use. Spring came. I planted tomatoes in the raised bed I had built in 2019, the year after Linda died, because she had always grown tomatoes, and I had always eaten them, and it seemed important to maintain something she had cared about. The tomatoes came up in May. I watered them and staked them and ate them in August, and they were good. Sarah called in June to check in one of her regular calls. Sunday evening. Nothing urgent. We talked about her boys, about a leak in her roof she was having fixed, about whether I was keeping my follow-up appointments with the cardiologist. Before she hung up, she said, almost as an aside, "The way you mentioned something you did not plan to mention, Michael asked me if I still had the photo from Mom's last birthday, the one in the kitchen. I said I had the original. She said he had asked because he wanted a copy. He had been carrying the one from his phone, but the resolution was poor. I said I would scan it and send it to her. She said that would be good. She said it the way she says things when she is trying not to make them into more than they are. After we hung up, I went to the box in the study where I keep the photographs I have not framed and found the one she meant Ellen at the kitchen table, laughing at something out of frame. Michael behind her with his hand on her shoulder. He was 23 in that photograph. He had driven up from Austin for the weekend. It was the last birthday Ellen had. I scanned it that night and sent it to Sarah without a note. I did not know what note to write, but I understood, looking at that photograph, that Michael had kept something, that he had not simply walked away and kept walking, that somewhere in the 6 years of silence, he had been doing the same thing I had been doing, watching from a distance, maintaining a record, waiting for a door that neither of us had yet figured out how to open. Michael did not call. I did not call him again after the 5 calls in November. I had decided not as a tactic, not as a position, but as a genuine understanding that the next move was not mine to make. I had made the error. I had deleted the message. I had failed to answer when answering was what was needed. The debt was mine and the timeline was his, and I would wait. This time, without the architecture of control around it, just wait. The way you wait for a structure to settle, knowing it will settle in its own time, and that forcing it will only create new fractures. I was sitting in the kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. The tomatoes were done. The raised bed was cleared. The mountains were that particular blue they get in September when the air is clean, when my chest began to hurt. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in movies. It was a pressure, distributed and sustained, the way I had felt the weight of Sarah's words on the porch in November, and I sat with it for a few minutes, thinking it would pass. And then I understood that it was not going to pass, and I called 911 and unlocked the front door and sat back down at the kitchen table and waited. The paramedics were there in 7 minutes. The one who took my blood pressure was a young woman named Torres, who had a calm, efficient manner that reminded me of the best engineers I had worked with. No wasted motion, no unnecessary words, everything in its right sequence. She said, "Sir, can you tell me when this started?" I told her. She said, "You did the right thing calling when you did." I told her I had learned recently that waiting too long to make a call was a mistake. She did not know what I meant. That was fine. I was in the hospital for 4 days. I had a blocked artery, 90% occlusion, the cardiologist said. A man named Dr. Okafor, who had the particular patience of someone who has explained serious things to many people and has learned to do it without drama. He said I would need a stent and some medication adjustments and significant changes to my diet and activity level. I said I understood. He said, "You're lucky you called when you did." I said I was aware of that. Sarah came the first day. She sat in the chair by the bed and we talked about small things, the house, the tomatoes, a problem she was having with her car's transmission, and did not talk about Michael. Before she left, she squeezed my hand and said, "I'll tell him." I said, "You don't have to." She said, "I know." She told him anyway. He came on the 3rd day. What I did not know, until Sarah told me afterward, was that he had not planned to come at all. James had called me the evening before, not to speak to me, I think, but because he had decided I needed to know something before I ran out of time to use it. He said Michael had signed a lease on an apartment in Seattle 2 weeks before the accident. He had already arranged to transfer within his company. He had told James, in the particular language of someone who has made a final decision and is explaining it calmly, that he was done waiting for something that was never going to change. James said he wasn't angry anymore. That was the part that scared me. He was just done. He paused. "I thought you should know that before he gets on a plane." I thanked him. He hung up without saying anything else. I lay in the hospital bed for a long time after that call, looking at the suspended tile ceiling, the kind I had specified on 100 projects, and I thought about the difference between a door that is closed and a door that has been removed from its frame entirely. Then I picked up the phone. I did not call Sarah. I called Michael directly from the hospital room at 9:47 in the evening from a number he would not recognize as mine. He answered on the second ring. I said, "It's your father. I'm in the hospital. I wanted you to hear it from me." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Which hospital?" I told him. He said, "I'll come in the morning." I said he didn't have to. He said, "I know." It was a Tuesday morning, early, before the hospital had fully committed to its daytime rhythms, and I heard the door, and I turned my head, and he was there. 28 years old. He looked like the person I remembered, and also like someone I would need to learn again from the beginning. He was wearing a dark green jacket I didn't recognize. He stood near the door for a moment, and then he came and sat in the chair Sarah had sat in 2 days before. We did not speak for a while. The monitors made their sounds. A nurse passed in the hallway. I said, "I'm glad you came." He said, "I'm glad you're okay." That was all. We sat in the room together for perhaps 20 minutes. I was not counting, and then he stood and said he had to get to work. And I said, "Of course." And he said he'd check in with Sarah, and I said that was good. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. He did not turn around. He said, "I sent you that message because I didn't know what else to do." I said, "I know." He said, "I needed you to answer." I said, "I know that too." He stood there for a moment longer. Then he left. I listened to his footsteps in the hallway until I couldn't hear them anymore, and then I looked at the ceiling, which was a standard suspended tile ceiling, the kind I had specified on 100 projects, and I did not count the tiles. I was discharged on Thursday. Sarah drove me home. She made sure I had the prescriptions and the follow-up appointment scheduled and the number for cardiac rehab. And then she left because she had her own life and her own work and her own things to attend to. I stood in the kitchen and the house was quiet around me. I picked up my phone and I opened the inbox. "Dad, I need you." Still there. I had not deleted it again. I read it one more time, the same 4 words I had read 11 months ago in this same kitchen, standing at this same table, and then I set the phone down. I had answered him, in the hospital room, in the only way he had allowed. I had said "I know" twice, which was not enough, and was also the most honest thing I had said in 6 years. He had left without turning around, and I did not know if he would come back. And I understood that not knowing was not a negotiating position. It was just the truth of where we were. I got a glass of water. I drank it at the sink, looking out the window at the backyard, at the fence I had built in 1994, at the raised bed where the tomatoes had been. The mountains were there above the roofline. They are always there. I put the glass in the drying rack and went to the garage and got the drill bits I had bought in October and had not used. There were 3 other small jobs I had been putting off. I started with the one nearest to hand. I started with the back door. The weather stripping took 38 minutes. When I pressed the door shut at the end, the cold air was gone. The seal held. I stood there with my hand flat against the wood for a moment, feeling the stillness on the other side. Then I went inside.